We're starting a new series this morning. We're calling Waiting with Isaiah. So let me say a couple things about the title of the series. This is the first Sunday of what the season that the church calls Advent. If you didn't know that, it's the 4 Sundays prior to Christmas. Advent is an English word, which is translated from a Latin word, which is translated from a Greek word, that means coming. Specifically the coming of God. So because Advent is a season where we anticipate the coming of God, Advent is a season of waiting, historically. So during the season of Advent, we spend some time focusing on this topic of waiting. And historically, that happens in sort of 3 different planes. So we'll do this a little bit this morning. We spend some time reflecting on the waiting that the people of God went through prior to God coming in the person of Jesus. So that's sort of one dimension. We spend some time thinking about and reflecting on the kind of waiting that often characterizes the Christian journey. And let's be honest, if you've been following Jesus for any length of time, you probably have some moments that are punctuated, punctuation points in your journey where God revealed something to you or radically changed something in you or convicted you of, moments that you can look back and go, that was a moment that changed my life. But between those moments, there are these vast periods of waiting where we are just living our lives in the hope that God will somehow break in and do something new in our world. So the Christian journey is often a season of waiting. And then obviously for Christian people, we're waiting for the return of Christ and the final consummation of all things, where Jesus reconciles all things to God. So there's that aspect of waiting. So those are sort of the 3 dimensions. All of that's going on in this 4 Sundays prior to Christmas. So that's the waiting piece. All the scriptures that we've chosen for this year's Advent season come from the Hebrew prophet Isaiah. And so we're waiting with Isaiah. So let me give you a little background on Isaiah for those of you who aren't familiar with him. Isaiah lived and worked, ministered, spoke in the last third of the 8th century BC. So we're talking between 750 and 700 BC. He lived in the land of Israel. At the time, Israel had undergone something of a civil war, so it was a divided nation. Originally, the nation of Israel, when it was constituted, it was 12 tribes united as one nation. They had a civil war. 10 of those tribes banded together and retained the name Israel. So you can see that area, pink, Israel there in the north. 10 of the 12 tribes retained the name of Israel. 2 of the 12 banded together and began to identify as Judah. And that's the blue area toward the south. So when Isaiah's living, he's living in and around the city of Jerusalem, which is the capital of this southern territory of Judah. And it's to the people of Judah that he's primarily speaking. Okay? Now, what's super important to understand about Isaiah, to appreciate his various visions that we're going to look at over the next 4 weeks, is he watched during the course of his life, this northern territory of Israel, they were attacked by the Assyrian Empire around 730 BC. It was a brutal military conquest. It was devastating. All of the inhabitants of Israel were either killed or they were deported. And they never returned. So it was a complete annihilation. And he watched that. With all of the devastation that comes with, I've not lived through war. Some of you have seen it yourselves, and you've experienced it. So for those of you who haven't, like me, we just have to sort of stretch our minds. A foreign empire, a superpower, rolls in with their massive arsenal and just annihilates an entire people group. Isaiah watched that. He watched that happen. He experienced it. He heard it, felt it. So Isaiah, as he's talking to the people of Judah, part of what's driving him is he's concerned that something similar will happen to them. But I think, and you and I should be able to appreciate this, he's just longing for a different reality. Right? He's seen a reality that's characterized by violence and injustice and despair and depression. And so he's longing for something different. A reality that's characterized by peace, justice, joy, deliverance. Those are the visions that we're going to look at over the next 4 weeks. It's his vision of this new reality. We're going to start this morning by talking about peace. His vision of a peaceable kingdom. Okay? So we're waiting with Isaiah for peace. I don't think it's unfair to say that the history of humankind is a history of war. I mean, the story that our sacred scriptures tell is that's central to the human problem. I mean, you don't get 2 pages into this book before you've got one person killing another. And then, at least in my Bible, right, that's on this page. And then I just go like one more page, and what was violence of one person against one person has now become escalating violence, unlimited retribution for wrongdoing. And then we just flip one more page, right, as I'm just reading the story. I'm told that the entire world is full of violence. I mean, in a matter of 3 pages, we go from God creating out of nothing this world that's supposed to reflect God's likeness to a world that is completely full of violence. I mean, the history of humankind is a history of violence and war and killing each other. Now, how do you fix that? Let's just imagine, for the sake of argument, that was not God's idea. That God doesn't actually want the world to operate that way. How do you fix it? How do you create a peaceable world when it's inhabited by people who seem hell-bent on hurting one another? The first attempt, let me tell you what you don't do. The first attempt is a global flood. You know the flood narrative? That's the first attempt. So what we do is we get rid of all of the bad people. We find the one good guy, like the one good guy that we can say he's righteous. We get the one good guy and his family, we stick him in a boat, we get rid of everybody else. So it's literally a global act of violence. If we just keep the one good guy, surely that will solve the problem. Does it solve the problem? We're 1 page after the flood narrative, and we're right back to killing each other. So one of the things that this story, our sacred narrative, is trying to tell you is we've got a problem, and a big global act of violence is not the way that it's going to get fixed. How does it get fixed? How does God actually address or produce or create or lead to a peaceable world among people who seem hell-bent on war? And not just international war. Let's be honest. You and I are hell-bent on war. We have found, I'm sure many of you watched football yesterday, we have found safe domestic outlets for it. But if you, in the dark recesses of your heart, we are people who are hell-bent on war. We have hearts of war. And we find certain people that we are willing to outlet that on. How do you create a peaceable kingdom in a world full of people who are hell-bent on war? Isaiah's vision is that you have to change the people. You have to do something that changes the people. that changes their consciousness, that changes the way they operate, the way they understand things. So here's Isaiah's vision. It says in chapter 2, starting verse 1, this is a vision that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be the highest of all, the most important place on earth. It will be raised above the other hills, and people from all over the world will stream there to worship. People from many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God. There he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the Lord's teaching will go out from Zion, his word will go out from Jerusalem. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation nor train for war anymore." Sounds nice, doesn't it? Now, before he has this vision of a peaceable kingdom, this future peaceable kingdom, Isaiah has an indictment for the people of Judah. And prophets, this part of their stock and trade. It's what they do. His specific indictment for the people of Judah is that they don't know God. Which is an interesting thing to accuse them of, because if you take it all the way back to Abraham, they've got 1,500 years of lived experience with Yahweh. And yet Isaiah feels like he can look at them and say, "You don't know your master." This is the root of all of our problems, is knowing God. Not whether God exists or not, but who God is. What God is like, what God wants, what God cares about, how God operates. Isaiah looks at the people of Judah and says, "You don't know God." Now, they certainly would have. What are you talking about? Of course we know God. But he's saying, no, you don't. And here's how he knows in their world. Okay, you can decide if there are parallels in our world. What he says to them is, here's how I know. You guys have a really well-established sacrificial religious apparatus. I mean, you observe feast days and festivals, and you parade through the temple courts with your offerings, and you bring the blood of bulls and goats and rams and lambs, and you're devout. You're really good at it. You observe all of the religious stuff. But your lives lack mercy. So what he says to them is, yeah. You do all the sacrifices, you come to the temple and you get the blood of all the animals and whatever. That's great. But you shed the blood of innocent victims. You don't help people who are oppressed. You don't defend people who are the most vulnerable, like widows and orphans. See, in Isaiah's mind, God is a certain God and operates a certain way and cares about certain things. And the fact that people who claim to know this God, who claim to trust and follow this God, live a certain way while also engaging in sort of this religious system, to Isaiah is like, yeah, you obviously don't know God. How does this happen? Let's assume for a moment that Isaiah is right. How does it happen? How over the course of 1,500 years, with all of this lived experience, with all of this religious apparatus in place, coming to the temple, engaging in all of this stuff, how is it possible that someone like Isaiah could look at you and could say, you don't know God? I mean, just put yourself in their shoes. Imagine if you came to church, You've been a faithful Christian all your life. You come to church, you read your Bible, you do this, that, and the other thing, and you came here and you sat down, and someone looked at you and said, you have no idea who God is. I would be insulted by that. But let's assume for a minute he's right. How's it happen? For them, many of you know their story. Way before they were ever a nation, they were a population of slaves. They spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt. They were poor, weak, defenseless. They had no hope, no future. Their only option was a God of rescue. Their only option was to cry out to God for rescue and for God to break into their world and do something about their situation, which is what happened. So from the very beginning, they understood God as a God who rescues the needy, as a God who hears the cries of the oppressed and answers, shows up, rescues, does something. That's how they knew God initially. But by the time you get to the prophet Isaiah, that's not their situation anymore. By the time you get to the prophet Isaiah, they're not the most powerful nation in the world, but they're not doing bad. They've got a king, they got a Federal Reserve, they got a military, they've got hundreds and hundreds of years of national culture making. They're doing okay for themselves. You see what happens in this process, this sort of national evolutionary process, is you start by knowing God as someone who comes to rescue you, to save you. Many of you knew God that way originally. That God met you when you needed God the most. When you were weak, when you were defenseless, when you had no hope, when you had no future, that's when God broke into your world. And so you knew God initially as a God of rescue, a God who saves. But then over the course of your life, you build a life, and then you have stuff. And somehow in that process, you start to think that God is now a God who is primarily interested with protecting your stuff or protecting your life as you know it. That instead of God being a God who hears the cries of the oppressed and the needy and will come to the rescue, God is now kind of underwriting our life of power and prosperity. But they're not on the bottom rung anymore. I don't necessarily know that they're at the top, but they're not at the bottom. But somebody is. It didn't occur to them that there's somebody out there who might be crying out to God for rescue from them. And that because God is someone who hears the cries of the people who need him the most, God's going to answer that. Even if it means temporarily having to be against the people that he once rescued back in the day. So when Isaiah looks at them and says, you don't know God, what he's saying is you've forgotten. And this is a typical indictment of the prophets. They're constantly looking at the people of Israel and saying, don't forget. Don't forget. Don't forget where you come from. Welcome the stranger. Welcome the foreigner. Take care of the needy. Take care of the oppressed. Don't marginalize people because you were those people. And remember what I did for you. Remember how I met you. Remember how I rescued you. Remember how I cared for you. Don't forget that that's where you were. Other people are there now. And I care for them the same way that I care for you. They've forgotten all that. So their biggest problem, and I would argue our biggest problem, is always how we know God. That if I'm reading Isaiah's vision appropriately, he's looking at lives of war and violence, both literal and kind of interpersonal, metaphorical. He's seeing lives of violence, and it's rooted for him in how they think about their God. And that's always how it goes in the Bible. Injustice is always the result of what the Bible calls idolatry. We think wrongly about God and we live wrongly. They always go hand in hand. This is the thing that has to change, is the way that they think about God. And that's Isaiah's vision. God's going to do something to do that, to make that, to have that effect on human consciousness. To use his language, what he says is God's going to do something to raise the mountain of the Lord's house. To raise the mountain of the Lord's house above all the other high hills. The mountain of the Lord's house refers to the temple in Jerusalem. That was the place where ancient Jews believed that God's presence actually dwelt among them. So it's a pretty sacred space. It wasn't just like any old church. In their understanding, the actual Spirit of God dwelt among them in the temple in Jerusalem. So Isaiah's vision is that someday God's going to do something where the presence of God among people is going to be elevated, specifically what he says above the other hills. That refers to rival worship centers. In the ancient world, worship was often conducted on high hills, high places. So you always built altars on the tops of mountains, the tops of hills. So the vision here, the imagery, is that God's going to do something that's going to elevate the presence of God above rival worship centers, whatever other stuff people happen to be worshiping. And when that happens, people are going to flock from all over the place, from all over the world. They're going to come and they're going to learn. They're going to learn from Israel's God how to walk in God's paths. That's what's going to happen. This is Isaiah's vision, 700 BC. And he says, here's the consequence. God's going to raise up his presence. People are going to flock from all over the world. They're going to learn God's ways. And what you're going to see happen is a total reorientation of the way that people relate to one another. They're going to literally go from people of violence and war to people of peace. And the imagery is what they do with their weapons of war. They're going to take their swords and their spears, which are weapons of war, and they are going to beat them into plowshares and pruning hooks. They're going to take weapons used to kill each other, and they're going to transform them into tools that are used to cultivate new life. See, Isaiah understands God to be a God of peace. That's how Isaiah understands Yahweh. That if you're going to leave a rival worship center and you're going to come and you're going to sit in the presence of God and you're going to learn God's ways, this is going to be the impact. You are no longer going to be a person of war. You are going to take your tools and your weapons of war and you are going to transform them into tools that cultivate new life. Now, as Christian people, we believe this actually happened in the person of Jesus Christ. That 2,000 years ago, Isaiah's vision of God doing something to raise the mountain of the Lord's house, we would say that's Jesus himself. Jesus referred to himself as the Lord's temple. Right? They thought God's presence dwelt in a building. Jesus would say, no, God's presence dwells in me. Jesus would say, when I'm lifted up, when I'm raised up from the earth, same language that Isaiah uses in his vision, when I'm raised up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself. That's John chapter 12. This is Isaiah's vision. God's going to do something to raise God's presence in the world, and it's going to draw all men to God. And there they're going to learn God's ways. And the impact is going to be that they go from being people of war to people of peace. So, we have to ask ourselves the question, why 2,000 years after the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ are we still people of war? I mean, if Isaiah's vision is that God's going to do something, people are going to come from all over the globe, which has happened, it's indisputable. 2,000 years, I think right now there are 3 billion professing Christians on the planet. It's the largest religious group on earth. Literally covers every corner of the globe. So following the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that word has gone out. It's gone out. And people from every corner of the globe have come to Christ. And yeah, I don't know that we're characterized by peace. I think it's probably fair to say that most of us and most of the world is more peaceful than it was in some regards, right? I mean, it's hard to fully appreciate exactly how violent the world was 2,000 years ago. But we also know that the 20th century was the most violent century in human history. And look, it's not just about the world out there. I mean, that's something we should kind of expect, right? People who don't pledge their allegiance to Jesus, we should kind of expect them to be engaged in endless conflict. How many of you have experienced war inside the church? I mean, not like literal, physical violence, but there's a lot of hearts of war inside the church. I mean, I just got finished reading a 2,000-year history of the Christian church, and every single page, it was like, man, every season of the church has been sort of marred by entanglement in violence. I mean, we just cannot seem to extract ourselves from it. Why is that? Is it just that it's just, hey, look, it just takes a while? Maybe, God's timing is God's timing. I don't know. Maybe it just takes a while. Or maybe it's that we're coming to Christ in a way that doesn't actually alter the way that we think about God. If their problem was that they didn't know their master, didn't know God, and that resulted in lives that were at war with other people, then if we are people who are at war with one another or with them, right, those people, whoever the people are, if you find yourself with a heart of war toward people, is it possible that if you dialed it back, somewhere sort of deep down, if you peel back the layers, there's a way of thinking about God that's faulty? I mean, look, is it not true that for many of you, I would imagine, if you grew up in some sort of a Christian tradition, going to church, it's very normal for us to talk and think about God in much the same sacrificial way that they would have. Right? They thought about God as someone who, for whatever reason, sacrifice in ancient Israel in the Hebrew Bible is a very tricky thing to pin down. There's lots of different forms of sacrifice. They did sacrifice for a number of different reasons. It's really difficult to figure out exactly what would have been going on in the hearts and minds of a worshiper. But here's the bottom line. For whatever the reason, they believed that God needed or wanted sacrifice. And so they brought God sacrifices. Bulls and rams and lambs and goats and, it was this system. Is it not true that many of us have been taught to think about God as someone who needs and wants sacrifice? I mean, not bulls and rams and lambs and goats anymore. We just take out the bulls and rams and lambs and goats and we put Jesus in their place. But we don't think about God differently. That we're coming to God through Christ, but we're maintaining the same thought about who God is as they would have had. And when that happens, it has and continues to underwrite a certain way of detaching our faith system from how we actually live, which is exactly what they were doing. Faith sort of devolves into kind of a transaction where God does something, apparently violent, that you benefit from. How you live is sort of incidental. I think this happens to a lot of people. God is not someone who needs or wants sacrifice. Maybe the first time some of you have ever heard somebody say that. And look, I know that there's a decent amount of real estate in this book that would suggest otherwise, if you read it a certain way. But every single Hebrew prophet, starting with Samuel, Isaiah, right in chapter 1, all the way to ultimately Jesus himself. Jesus' favorite Hebrew verse, the one he quoted most often, was from Hosea. He would say, I want you to go learn what this means. I mean, think about that. You need to actually go think about this. It'll transform the way that you think about your Christian faith. Go learn what this means. This is God speaking. I do not want sacrifice. I don't desire it. Hebrew prophets have been saying it since Samuel. What makes you think I want your sacrifices? What makes you think I want you offering me stuff? I don't need and want sacrifice. It's not about me. What Jesus says is, what I do want, I want lives of mercy. That's what I want. Because that's who I am. You want to offer me a sacrifice? Offer me the sacrifice of mercy. Then I'll know you get it. Then I'll know you get me. Because when you come to the cross, what you're seeing in the cross, what you're supposed to see, is a God who does not combat violence with an act of violence. You see a God who combats sin and violence by suffering it. I mean, that is the groundbreaking, upending vision that Isaiah had in chapter 52 and 53. That someday God is gonna change human consciousness, not by bringing some heavy hand strong arm against people, but by suffering. What kind of God would ever do such a thing? That's what, as Christian people, we believe happened in and through the person of Jesus Christ. It's supposed to be a consciousness-changing event. It changes primarily the way that you think about God, but then changes the way that you think about people, and ultimately changes the way that you act. That your God is not a God of war. It's not someone who needs to benefit from violence. Your God is a God of self-sacrificing love. So as his children, our call is to beat our swords and spears into plowshares and pruning hooks. And that's not a vision of what it's supposed to look like after the good guys win. That's a proactive vision. It's about how we relate to one another that makes conflict less likely. Because we're peaceable people. Look, Isaiah was waiting for a peaceable kingdom. He was waiting for God to do something that would change human consciousness, that would bring about a kingdom of peace. That happened. It happened 2,000 years ago. We are still waiting. We're still waiting for Christ to return and reconcile all things to God. But while we wait, it's not a passive waiting. It's an active participation in the way of God, which is the way of peace. If you come to the cross and somehow you've managed to think about God as underwriting whatever your life happens to be, I'm saying you don't know God. To come to the cross is to see God as a God of unending, self-sacrificing mercy, and to begin moving in that direction, right? If we long for, if the solving of international disputes sounds like a pipe dream to you, let's not think about that. Most of us aren't qualified to think about that anyway. Let's just start with your heart of war toward whomever. Your heart of war toward your spouse. Your heart of war toward a family member. Your heart of war toward a coworker or a friend. Your heart of war toward those people or that group. Whatever it is. I'm telling you, I have a heart of war. And I'm guessing you do too. But I'm called to be a person of peace, to help facilitate a peaceable kingdom because I follow a God of peace. And I know that because of the cross. I know that because of the cross. And that's what it means to know God. So like Isaiah said, come descendants of Jacob, right? Let's walk in the way of the Lord, the light of the Lord. We come to the cross to know God, and out of the cross we live. We live in God. Amen. We're going to finish our service this morning.